If you've ever seen a photograph of a quantum computer, you already have a picture in your head of what one looks like, even if you've never set foot near one. It's usually a golden, chandelier-shaped structure, hanging inside a tall, cylindrical chamber, wrapped in a tangle of wires, sitting inside a room built specifically to keep it colder than deep space. That image isn't just a dramatic photo choice. It's the actual physical reality of almost every quantum computer that has ever existed. Superconducting qubits, the kind used by Google, IBM, and China's leading labs, only function properly inside a dilution refrigerator, a piece of equipment that can cost anywhere from $500,000 to several $1,000,000 on its own, requires specialized technicians to operate, and demands an entire supporting infrastructure of vacuum pumps, shielding, and precise environmental control just to keep a chip colder than the emptiest regions of outer space. That infrastructure is exactly why, until very recently, quantum computer and data center were treated as basically inseparable ideas. You couldn't have one without the other. That assumption just broke, not through some flashy, headline-grabbing quantum supremacy demonstration, but through a much quieter and in some ways more disruptive engineering achievement: a working quantum chip that operates at room temperature, needs no cryogenic cooling at all, fits inside a standard 19-inch server rack, and has already been installed at real research institutions, running real hybrid quantum classical workloads right now. This is the story of that chip, the company behind it, and why removing the need for an entire climate-controlled cryogenic facility changes the practical calculus of quantum computing in a way that's arguably more important in the near term than any single benchmark result. The company at the center of this story is Quantum Brilliance, an Australian-German quantum computing company founded in 2019 as a spin-out from the Australian National University, with operations based in Canberra and Stuttgart. Rather than building qubits out of superconducting circuits, which require extreme cold to suppress the thermal noise that would otherwise instantly destroy their fragile quantum states, Quantum Brilliance builds its qubits out of something almost poetically different: tiny, deliberately engineered imperfections inside synthetic diamond. The technical name for this defect is a nitrogen vacancy center, usually just called an NV center, and it works like this. Inside the incredibly rigid, tightly bonded crystal lattice of diamond, one carbon atom is removed, and a nitrogen atom is placed in the position right next to that missing spot. That combination, a nitrogen atom sitting beside a vacancy in an otherwise near-perfect diamond lattice, creates a tiny, isolated electronic system that behaves like a quantum bit, one that can be manipulated and measured using laser light and microwave signals, and crucially, one that remains stable at ordinary room temperature, without needing anywhere near the extreme cold that superconducting qubits require. The reason this works, when it wouldn't work for other qubit designs, comes down to the physical properties of diamond itself. Diamond is one of the hardest, most rigidly bonded materials in nature, and that rigidity turns out to matter enormously for keeping a fragile quantum state intact. Superconducting qubits are exquisitely sensitive to thermal vibrations, the random jostling of atoms that occurs naturally at any temperature above near absolute zero, which is precisely why they need such extreme cooling in the first place, to slow that thermal jostling, down to a level where it won't instantly scramble the delicate quantum information stored in the circuit. Diamond's crystal lattice is so tightly, rigidly bonded that it simply doesn't generate the same kind of disruptive vibrations at room temperature that would ordinarily destroy a fragile quantum state elsewhere. The NV center, nestled protectively inside that rigid lattice, ends up shielded from much of the environmental noise that plagues other qubit technologies, giving it what researchers describe as the longest coherence times, meaning the longest stretch of time a qubit can hold onto its quantum information reliably of any quantum system that operates at room temperature. It's worth being precise about what this technology can and cannot currently do, because the headline claim, "doesn't need a data center," is genuinely true and genuinely significant, but it comes with real, honest trade-offs that deserve equal attention. Diamond NV Center quantum chips currently offer far fewer qubits than the leading superconducting systems. Quantum Brilliance's roadmap target systems in the range of 25 to 100 qubits by 2026 and 2027, a modest number compared to superconducting processors like Google's Willow, which operates with just over 100 qubits itself but benefits from a far more mature, decade-long engineering effort behind it, or IBM's larger superconducting systems, which have pushed well beyond 1,000 qubits in their newer generations. In other words, this isn't a story about diamond quantum chips suddenly outcomputing the biggest cryogenic systems on raw power. It's a story about a fundamentally different trade-off: dramatically less infrastructure, dramatically lower cost, and dramatically greater portability in exchange for a currently smaller scale, less computationally powerful device. That trade-off turns out to matter enormously once you consider where and how quantum computers actually need to be deployed to be genuinely useful, rather than just impressive in a laboratory demonstration. A dilution refrigerator, capable of housing a superconducting quantum processor, typically costs somewhere between $500,000 and $3 million on its own, before you even account for the shielded room, the specialized vacuum and cooling infrastructure, the trained technical staff required to operate and maintain it, and the sheer physical footprint the whole setup demands, easily consuming a dedicated room or a significant chunk of a data center floor. Quantum Brilliance's portable systems, by contrast, are reportedly priced under $500,000. And because they require no cryogenics, no dilution refrigerator, and no specialized vacuum chamber, they can be installed directly into existing server racks, integrated alongside ordinary CPUs and GPUs in a conventional computing environment, without requiring an institution to build out an entirely separate, purpose-built cryogenic facility just to house the device. This isn't a hypothetical claim sitting only in a company's marketing materials either. In 2025, Quantum Brilliance deployed 3 of its quantum development kit systems at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, one of the United States' premier high-performance computing research facilities, giving the lab's advanced computing ecosystem testbed an on-site quantum computing cluster that staff could use to explore how to integrate this emerging technology directly into classical supercomputing workflows, rather than treating quantum computing as a separate siloed capability, accessible only through a cloud connection to some distant specialized facility. Andreas Sawatzky, the company's technology and innovation manager, described the core advantage plainly. While most experimental quantum computers demand extreme cooling, the diamond-based platform delivers usable quantum coherence in a compact, room-temperature package that slots into standard computing infrastructure rather than requiring its own dedicated environment. Europe saw a similarly telling deployment around the same time. In May of 2025, the Fraunhofer Institute for Applied Solid-State Physics, a leading German applied research institute, installed what it described as Europe's first compact room-temperature quantum accelerator, Quantum Brilliance's second-generation quantum development kit, directly into its existing high-performance computing infrastructure. Professor Rüdiger Kay, the institute's director, captured the sheer novelty of the moment with a comment that's worth repeating, because it says everything about how differently this technology behaves compared to what people have come to expect from quantum computers. He noted that this was likely the first time anyone had ever asked, "What should we do with the leftover space in the server rack when installing a quantum computer?" A question that would have sounded almost absurd for any previous generation of quantum hardware, all of which required entire dedicated rooms, not leftover rack space, just to operate at all. This is where the changes everything part of the story actually starts to earn its keep, because the practical implications of removing the cryogenic requirement ripple out considerably further than just convenience or cost savings, though both of those matter plenty on their own. Consider first the question of who can realistically access quantum computing hardware at all. Under the traditional model, gaining hands-on access to a quantum processor meant either being one of a small handful of institutions wealthy enough to build and operate your own dilution refrigerator facility, or renting time on a cloud-accessible quantum computer owned by one of the major players, IBM, Google, or a handful of specialized quantum computing companies, competing for scarce, shared processing time on a small number of machines scattered across the world. A room-temperature quantum chip that costs under $500,000 and slots into existing rack space fundamentally changes that access equation, putting genuine, hands-on quantum hardware within reach of universities, smaller research institutions, and companies that would never have had the budget or the physical infrastructure to build a cryogenic quantum computing facility of their own. Then consider the question of where quantum computing can physically be deployed, which is really the heart of what doesn't need a data center actually unlocks. A superconducting quantum computer, tethered permanently to its dilution refrigerator and its supporting cryogenic infrastructure, is inherently a stationary fixed location device. It exists in exactly one building, accessed either in person by researchers who travel to that facility or remotely through a cloud connection for everyone else. A room-temperature diamond quantum chip has no such constraint. It can be installed anywhere ordinary computing equipment can be installed, in a research lab, inside a data center rack, alongside conventional servers, aboard a vehicle, on a ship, or more provocatively, in field environments, far from any data center infrastructure at all. Quantum Brilliance's own positioning captures this shift directly, describing its mission as making quantum computing deployable everywhere, from data centers to what it calls the edge, and into the field, a phrase borrowed deliberately from the broader technology industry's concept of edge computing, moving processing power out of centralized facilities and directly to wherever data is actually being generated and needs to be analyzed in real time. This edge deployment angle has attracted serious attention from an unexpected but revealing source: defense and security applications, precisely the kind of use case where a piece of computing hardware being physically portable and independent of fixed infrastructure matters enormously more than raw computational power alone. Quantum Brilliance has secured a contract with Germany's Cyberagentur, the country's cyber innovation agency, working alongside the quantum software company Parity QC as part of a €35 million program specifically aimed at building a transportable quantum computer for defense applications, targeting delivery by 2027. It's worth sitting with what that phrase, transportable quantum computer for defense applications, actually implies, because it's a category of device that simply could not have existed under the traditional cryogenic model. You cannot transport a dilution refrigerator into a forward operating environment, mount it on a vehicle, or expect it to function reliably outside a carefully controlled research facility. A quantum processor that operates at ordinary room temperature, requiring no specialized cooling infrastructure at all, genuinely can be considered for exactly that kind of mobile, field-deployed application, which is precisely the capability this specific defense contract is betting real money on. It's also worth being honest about how this technology fits into the broader landscape of quantum computing approaches, because Quantum Brilliance is far from the only company exploring alternatives to the cryogenic superconducting model, and diamond NV centers are far from the only technology being explored for room temperature quantum applications. The broader diamond quantum sensing and computing field includes companies like Quantum Diamonds, which has completed proof-of-concept deployments of NV-based quantum magnetometers at major semiconductor manufacturers, using diamond quantum sensors to detect extraordinarily subtle magnetic field variations, useful for chip inspection and quality control, and Envision, whose Polaris platform, built around similar diamond quantum sensing principles, has been installed at cancer research institutions, including Memorial Sloan Kettering for advanced imaging applications. Separately, Adamant Quanta is targeting commercial delivery of chip-scale diamond atomic clocks, extraordinarily precise timekeeping devices built on related quantum principles, aimed at navigation and timing applications, an area that connects directly back to the same kind of GPS-independent positioning technology defense planners have been racing to develop using other quantum sensing approaches. Several of these diamond-based products, worth noting honestly, are already well past the pure research stage and generating real commercial revenue right now, a meaningfully different maturity level than the still experimental, laboratory-bound status of most superconducting quantum computing efforts. It's genuinely important, in the interest of giving you the complete, honest picture, rather than an uncritically enthusiastic one, to address the obvious competing question directly. If room temperature diamond quantum chips are this practical, this deployable, and this much cheaper, why haven't they simply replaced the enormously expensive, infrastructure-heavy superconducting approach that companies like Google and IBM continue to pour billions of dollars into? The honest answer comes back to that qubit count and performance trade-off mentioned earlier, and it's a real substantive limitation, not a minor footnote. Superconducting qubits, despite their brutal infrastructure demands, currently offer a considerably more mature, more scalable path toward the large qubit counts needed for the most computationally demanding quantum algorithms, the kind that promise genuine, dramatic advantages over classical computers on specific, hard problems. If, in the coming years, a cryogenic superconducting processor with 1,000 or more high-quality qubits demonstrates a clear, verified quantum advantage on some genuinely important computational problem, that headline-grabbing achievement is likely to keep attracting the lion's share of research funding, media attention, and industry investment, and reasonably so, given the sheer scale of computational advantage that kind of result could represent. A 25 to 100 qubit room temperature system, however remarkably deployable, simply isn't positioned to compete directly with that kind of raw computational firepower, at least not yet, and Quantum Brilliance's own leadership doesn't pretend otherwise. But this is exactly where the changes everything framing earns its honest keep, rather than overselling a niche technology as an outright replacement for the industry's flagship approach. Quantum Brilliance's own strategic argument isn't that diamond NV center chips will outcompute superconducting systems at the highest end of raw performance. It's that a huge range of genuinely valuable quantum computing applications don't actually require a 1,000-qubit machine at all, and that for those applications, a cheap, portable room temperature system that can be deployed directly alongside existing classical computing infrastructure without needing an entirely separate cryogenic facility opens up use cases that the biggest superconducting systems, however computationally powerful, simply cannot reach because of their fixed location and enormous supporting infrastructure requirements. A hybrid quantum classical computing cluster embedded directly inside an existing supercomputing environment, as demonstrated at Oak Ridge, lets researchers experiment with integrating quantum processing into everyday classical workflows in a way that would be far more cumbersome if every quantum calculation had to be routed out to a separate, remotely hosted cryogenic machine. A transportable quantum system for defense field applications simply has no cryogenic equivalent to compete against at all because no cryogenic system could be transported into that kind of environment in the first place. In both cases, the relevant comparison isn't diamond chip versus superconducting chip performing the identical task. It's diamond chip enabling an entirely new category of deployment that the superconducting approach was never going to reach, regardless of how many qubits it eventually accumulates. There's also a longer-term technical trajectory worth understanding, because it suggests this isn't simply a permanent, small-scale niche technology destined to stay confined to 25 or 100 qubits indefinitely. Quantum Brilliance has been working with IMEC, a leading semiconductor research institute based in Belgium, to explore how diamond qubit fabrication techniques can be made compatible with standard CMOS manufacturing processes, the same industrial semiconductor fabrication methods used to mass-produce ordinary computer chips by the billions. If that integration effort succeeds, it would open a genuinely significant path toward manufacturing diamond-based quantum chips using much of the same industrial infrastructure, precision, and manufacturing scale that the broader semiconductor industry already has in place, potentially allowing qubit counts on room temperature diamond systems to climb considerably faster than they otherwise might if each chip had to be built through slower, more specialized, boutique fabrication methods. That's a meaningfully different and considerably more optimistic long-term trajectory than simply assuming diamond quantum chips are permanently capped at the double or triple-digit qubit counts they currently offer. Pulling all of this together, what's actually happening, once you set aside the dramatic framing and look at the verified facts, is genuinely significant, even if it's a quieter, less flashy kind of significant than a headline about breaking the laws of physics or quadrillion-fold speed advantage over classical supercomputers. A real company has built a real, commercially available quantum processing chip that operates at ordinary room temperature, requires no cryogenic cooling infrastructure whatsoever, costs a fraction of what a comparable cryogenic system demands, and physically fits into the kind of server rack space that exists in ordinary computing facilities around the world already. That chip has already been installed and is actively running real hybrid quantum classical workloads at a major American national laboratory and a leading German applied research institute. And it's the foundation of an active, funded defense program aimed at building a genuinely field-transportable quantum computer, a category of device that simply did not and could not exist under the traditional cryogenic model that has defined quantum computing's public image for the entire history of the field so far. Does this change everything in the sense of making cryogenic superconducting quantum computers obsolete or delivering some world-altering computational breakthrough overnight? No, and any honest account of this story has to say so plainly. The two approaches are, for the foreseeable future, complementary rather than competing head-to-head on identical ground. Cryogenic superconducting systems chasing raw qubit count and computational power for the hardest, most demanding algorithmic problems, while room temperature diamond systems chase deployability, affordability, and access, opening quantum computing up to institutions, environments, and applications that the cryogenic approach was never going to reach, regardless of how far its qubit counts eventually climb. But that second half of the story, quantum computing escaping the confines of the specialized, climate-controlled data center and becoming something that can sit in a standard server rack, ride along in a defense vehicle, or get installed at a university without a multi-million-dollar cryogenics budget, is exactly the kind of unglamorous, infrastructure-level shift that tends to matter enormously more, in practical terms, over the following several years than any single dramatic laboratory demonstration ever does on its own. The chandelier-shaped gold-plated quantum computer hanging inside its own dedicated cryogenic chamber isn't going away anytime soon, but it's no longer the only picture that comes to mind when someone says the words quantum computer. And that quiet shift, a quantum chip that simply doesn't need a data center to function at all, may end up mattering more for how widely this technology actually spreads through the real world than any single qubit count record ever will. Let's dig a little deeper into how these diamond qubits actually get controlled and read out, because it explains why this technology can be so compact in the first place, and why it's genuinely different from simply shrinking down a cryogenic system rather than solving the underlying physics problem entirely. Each NV center inside the diamond lattice is manipulated using a combination of laser light and microwave pulses. Green laser light is used to initialize the qubit into a known starting state and, crucially, to read out its final state once a calculation finishes. Because the NV center emits a detectably different amount of red fluorescent light, depending on which quantum state it occupies, giving researchers a way to measure the outcome of a quantum operation using nothing more exotic than a sensitive optical detector. Microwave pulses, similar in basic principle to the microwaves used in superconducting qubit control, though at very different power and precision levels, are then used to actually manipulate the qubit's quantum state between that initialization and readout, executing whatever quantum operation the algorithm calls for. None of this requires cooling the diamond down anywhere near the temperature superconducting qubits need, because the entire control and readout scheme is built around properties of the NV center that remain robust at room temperature in the first place, rather than being an engineering workaround bolted onto a fundamentally cold-dependent qubit design. This distinction matters because it highlights something important about why quantum brilliance's approach isn't simply the same quantum computer, but smaller. It's a genuinely different underlying physical qubit platform, chosen specifically because its physics happens to be compatible with room temperature operation from the ground up, rather than an attempt to miniaturize or work around the cryogenic requirements that superconducting qubits are stuck with. That's also why the company can credibly claim its systems require no cryogenics, no dilution refrigerator, and no complex vacuum chamber at all, rather than simply a smaller or cheaper version of that same infrastructure. The laser and microwave control equipment needed is, by comparison to a dilution refrigerator, relatively compact and well within the kind of footprint that fits into a standard server rack alongside conventional computing hardware, which is precisely the packaging quantum brilliance has already demonstrated in real working deployments. It's also worth placing this development inside the broader context of what the quantum computing industry has been calling, with a mix of genuine concern and marketing opportunism, the road to utility-scale quantum computing, meaning quantum computers that deliver genuine practical value on real-world problems rather than remaining laboratory curiosities or narrow benchmark-chasing demonstrations. A recurring theme across the industry, echoed by companies working on entirely different technical approaches, is that raw qubit count alone isn't the only bottleneck standing between today's quantum computers and that kind of practical usefulness. Separately from quantum brilliance's room temperature approach, other companies have been tackling different pieces of the same broader infrastructure puzzle. For instance, developing specialized cryogenic amplifier components designed to dramatically cut the waste heat generated by superconducting quantum systems, addressing the fact that even cryogenic quantum computers, once you account for the enormous energy demands of running a dilution refrigerator continuously, can represent a meaningful and growing energy burden for the data centers that house them, an issue that's become considerably more visible as quantum computing facilities have scaled up alongside an already energy-hungry AI data center boom. Room temperature diamond systems sidestep that particular energy problem entirely, simply by never needing the cryogenic infrastructure that generates it in the first place, which is a genuinely underappreciated advantage as data centers everywhere face growing scrutiny over their electricity consumption. There's a useful way to think about how this story fits into the bigger picture of where quantum computing as a whole seems to be heading, and it echoes a pattern that's shown up repeatedly across the history of computing more broadly. Early classical computers, the room-sized vacuum tube machines of the 1940s and 1950s, were similarly confined to specialized, purpose-built facilities, requiring dedicated staff, extensive supporting infrastructure, and enormous cost, before the invention of the transistor and later the integrated circuit gradually shrank that same computational capability down into packages that could fit on a desk, then in a pocket, then into virtually every object with a power source. Nobody's claiming diamond NV center quantum chips represent quite that scale of transformation just yet. Current qubit counts are still far too modest for that comparison to be taken literally. But the underlying pattern, a technology moving from requires its own specialized, expensive, dedicated facility toward fits into existing infrastructure that already exists everywhere, is exactly the kind of shift that, historically, tends to precede a technology's transition from a niche research tool into something genuinely widespread. And it's a pattern worth watching closely as room temperature quantum systems continue maturing over the next several years. None of this diminishes the genuine, ongoing achievements happening on the cryogenic superconducting side of the field, work like Google's Willow chip crossing the fault tolerance error correction threshold, or China's Zhuangzi program demonstrating similar milestones. Work that remains, by most measures, the leading edge of raw quantum computational power right now, and will likely remain so for the foreseeable future. But it does mean that the picture of quantum computing's near-term future is considerably more varied and more interesting than a single race toward ever larger cryogenic machines housed in ever more specialized data centers. Some of the most consequential quantum computing news over the next several years may not come from a qubit count record at all, but from stories like this one, quiet, unglamorous infrastructure shifts that determine not how powerful a single quantum computer can become, but how many places, institutions, vehicles, and everyday computing environments a working quantum processor can actually reach. So the next time you picture a quantum computer, it might be worth updating that mental image just slightly. Not just the gold chandelier suspended inside its own dedicated cryogenic chamber, guarded by a room built specifically to keep it colder than outer space, but also somewhere in the same building, or perhaps somewhere considerably further afield, a small, unremarkable-looking box sitting quietly in whatever server rack space happened to be free, running at the same room temperature as everything else around it, doing real quantum computing without anyone needing to ask a single question about how to keep it cold enough to work at all. That's not a smaller, weaker version of the same old story. That's a genuinely different chapter, and it's one that's already being written, quietly, in labs from Tennessee to Stuttgart right now,